Well, welcome everybody. This is Barry Lynn. I'm the Executive Director of the Open Markets Institute, and it's great to have you today with us for, it's probably our first sort of post-COVID book event. And we used to do a lot of book events each year, and they were mainly cocktails, and they were a lot of fun, but it was very much for folks in Washington, D.C. And actually one of the good things about this new era is that we do get to bring in a lot more people to our discussions. And today we have absolutely a really terrific discussion. It's going to last for an hour. And the one thing I want to say right here at the beginning is there will be a Q&A period. So you can actually start sending your questions at any moment, anytime you want to. We'll be collecting them, and we'll probably devote the last 15, 20 minutes of the discussion to taking your questions. One thing is, if I'm in a place where I haven't used this, the technology in the house I'm in in this way before, so if I suddenly vanish, I trust that David and Zephyr will be able to continue without me. So So anyway, we have two terrific people with us today, two old friends, two sort of great American heroes who have been sort of fighting concentrated power for a long time. And, Zephyr, I'll just give a sort of a really brief sort of introduction. Zephyr is a professor of law at Fordham. She's a specialist in corruption law and anti-monopoly. Zephyr, as most of you know, is also a very formidable politician. She's run 3 times for major office and has really made a mark in doing so. And Zephyr is also one of America's best grassroots organizers. I mean, it's rare to see someone who can kind of organize in this way, but also to, sort of run a top-level political campaign. Zephyr's first book, we're here today to discuss her second book, but her first book was something you should also buy. It's Corruption in America, From Ben Franklin's Snuff Box to Citizens United. That came out in 2014. It's, like I said, it's a terrific book. David Dayen is someone I've admired for a really long time. He's one of the hardest working journalists in America. And David was one of the last people to be able to make a pretty good living at doing freelance, which is it's never been easy, and it's become much harder in recent years. David, for many years, he wrote for places like Salon and The Intercept. About a year ago, he was named executive editor of The American Prospect, which is one of my favorite publications in the world. It's there's some of my old friends there, Bob Kuttner and Harold Meyerson, and they're still there. But David has sort of kind of updated a lot of the operation and sort of energized parts of it. And it's really great to have David at the American Prospect. This is also David's second book. His first one was called Chain of Title, how 3 ordinary Americans uncovered Wall Street's great foreclosure crisis. That came out in 2016. And again, that was also an important book worth sort of going back to and revisiting. But today we're here to discuss these 2 books, Zephyr's Break 'em Up, and the subtitle is Recovering Our Freedom from Big Ag, Big Tech, and Big Money. And then we have also David's book, which is Monopolized, Life in the Age of Corporate Power. And I bought both of these books in a physical bookstore. I went to Politics and Prose in Washington, and I bought 2 copies of each. So I encourage everybody out there to do that. Go buy 2 copies of each of these books, one for yourself and one to give away. But anyway, so what we're going to do is we wanted to start off by giving both Zephyr and David the sort of opportunity to say a few words about their book and about this issue. And I'll just start with Zephyr.
Thank you. Thank you so much for hosting this. I'm so excited to be doing this with David, who is one of my very favorite people to listen to everything he says online, and who still manages to do incredibly deep thinking outside of Twitter. And then Barry Lynn has had a real profound impact on both my thinking and the growing, very exciting anti-monopoly movement in this country. So it's very exciting to be here. I come at anti-monopoly from the perspective of a democracy activist. I've been writing about how do we govern ourselves? How do we have a free society for most of my career? And so the way that I approach the question of this radical concentration of power, which I'm going to take for granted for the purposes of my short talk, and then we can talk about what's actually happening later, from the perspective of saying this really presents a very significant threat and erosion of freedom, equality, and core democratic values. So in brief, I look at the ways in which radical monopolization is undermining our basic democratic institutions. One being the free press and the way in which concentrated big tech has murdered local and working class journalism. Another is the role of corporate monopolies in destroying our judicial system, and the ways in which monopolization and arbitration have combined. Monopolization, big corporate monopolies have used arbitration as a tool of control and a tool to privatize this very essential set of rights that we should have: the right to an open court, to a judge who's paid for by the public, not by one of the parties, the right to appeal. All of that is wiped out through arbitration, and it's very connected to corporate monopolization. I talk about the ways in which this corporate monopolization is also, which is often thought about in race-neutral terms, is not race neutral, and mergers are not race neutral activities, and the ways in which monopolization has served as a kind of bleaching out of American power, destroying key nodes of Black economic power, which in turn means Black political power and economic power in so many different communities of color. And then I talk about the sort of maybe the core thesis is that we know that big corporations fund super PACs, think tanks. Recent news shows that Amazon and Google both have their fingers deep inside Yale's School of Management's Antitrust Institute and George Mason. That is horrifying, but part of our contemporary framework of thinking about things. The real threat is that these corporations are themselves becoming a form of private government and are directly regulating us as workers and as members of a political community, taxing us, spying on us, and coming to be a kind of shadow government coexisting with the formal democratic government. So it's not just that these big corporations are corrupting democracy, they themselves are a form of corrupt non-democracy. And I talk about the ways in which you could think about them a little bit like the mob, and they have a lot of similarities to the mob's coexistence with democratic structures, or other modes of illegitimate government. So my call to action is to say that we have to stop thinking about anti-monopoly as a mere economic disaster, which it is. And understand that this is basically this tool. Monopoly is a form of politics, and this is a tool that is used to replace all the planks of the good ship democracy with the planks of the ship monopoly that is not just really dangerous in how much value and wealth it extracts out of society, but is really dangerous because it gives totally unaccountable, whimsical, powerful individuals who are profit-seeking way too much power over each of us and really erodes our freedom.
Great. And David, you...
Sure. Okay. Yeah. Well, thanks, guys. This is kind of like getting the band back together. Barry and Zephyr and I appeared on a panel in Congress before the Congressional Antitrust Subcommittee. I think 2 years ago. We did a Netroots Nation event, I think 4 or 5 years ago. So every couple of years, we all have to get together and have this discussion, and I welcome it. And I can't say enough good things about Zephyr's book, which goes into subjects that I don't cover in mine, and I think they're perfectly complementary. And so Barry's suggestion of 2 apiece sounds good to me. So it's not just Zephyr's books of my own that have come out in the last couple of years and in the years to come about this problem. We've actually seen a full shelf of literature built, including Barry's own book, which comes out, I believe, next month, Liberty from All Masters. And of course, he did sort of the founding document here called Cornered many years ago. So the going into this, the question that I had in my mind was, well, there are all these books already on the shelf about monopoly or in motion. What can I add? Where can I add value? Being a journalist, I really thought that what has been missing, there's a lot of tremendous work about the history of monopoly, about the structures, about the side effects, about specific markets and what they look like. I thought what was missing is talking to people, and going out in the world back when you actually could go out in the world, and talking to people about how corporate power affects their daily lives. They don't necessarily see it in the technical terms that we hear a lot in Washington. No one referred to the Herfindahl-Hirschman index when I was on the road. No one talked about market share and Section 2 of the Sherman Act or anything like that. But what they did all know, to a man and woman, and this was Democrats, Republicans. I talked to libertarians. I talked to Trump supporters. I talked to liberals. What they did all share was this sense that there is something wrong with our economy, that there are these forces beyond their control that are making their choices for them, that are constraining their ability to prosper, constraining their ability to do what they wanted in life. Constraining their ability to display their talents. And the common denominator usually was a big corporation. So whether I was talking to farm families in Iowa and hearing about a conversation between a father and daughter, a daughter who grew up on the farm and always wanted to stay there and couldn't because of the influence of big ag and the inability for family farmers to survive. And she talked about this conversation she had with her father at she got a job at Best Western, and she called her dad one day and was talking about struggles in her job. She had to fire somebody and something else screwed up, and finally she just burst out with, "Dad, all I wanted to do was farm." And that sort of moment and capturing those moments was what was important to me in this book. That this is a situation where people are really losing control of their lives and their livelihoods as a result of monopoly. And so each chapter in the book, I talk to a different person, go to a different sector of the economy, and discuss why this influence takes place. And sometimes it's kind of straightforward ways, and sometimes it's the influences and the side effects of monopoly are very, very odd. I'll give you another example. I was talking to people regarding Amazon. Particularly I talked to a lot of third-party sellers who sell on the Amazon marketplace. And there are 2.5 million of them. This is easily one of the largest sectors, if not the largest sector of small business people in the United States and maybe around the world. And like any kind of subgroup, there are conventions and there are get-togethers among these various sellers. And human nature being what it is, people couple up at these events. And I talked to a couple who met at a third-party seller convention where they trade tips and strategies of how to get ahead. And they started dating. They came from the same area, and they moved in together. And the day they moved in together, Amazon suspended their accounts. And it was very hard for them to get a straight answer as to why. You can't find a human being at Amazon if you're a third-party seller to actually talk to. But what they eventually learned is that the Amazon, through its algorithm, saw that two third-party sellers were coming from the same IP address and immediately thought there was some foul play there, and then suspended the accounts. So this couple had to get permission from Amazon to live together. And that's just sort of a perfect example of the power and control that a handful of corporations have over the lives of so many Americans. And so that was really my contribution, was to really talk to people about how monopoly affects their lives. And you know, I look forward to the rest of this discussion. We can talk about more about that.
Yeah, actually, and just give people a sort of an overview of the discussion. And you know, we do only have an hour, but you know, we get to cover a lot of territory. And by the end of this, we are going to be sort of giving folks some hope, you know, looking at what some of the anti-monopoly fighters out there are doing, you know, and actually sort of giving people an understanding of why we are going to win this fight in the end. But, sure. But it's important also for folks to understand the magnitude of the problem. So I kind of want to start us off in the tunnel, deep in the back part of the tunnel where it's still very dark. And you know, and then move us towards the sunlight. So you know, and I guess, you know, Zephyr, and this is a question for both of you, but you know, I'll start with Zephyr first. You know, what are you've kind of touched on this, that this is an issue of democracy, but what are the things that are most terrifying? What should the you know, people who are paying attention to this, sort of tuned in today, or just average citizens today, what is the most terrifying thing about monopolization in America today?
Well, when I started writing this book, I did not expect to end up writing repeatedly about suicide and depression. But one of the side effects that comes up repeatedly is that small business owners fighting Amazon, that David wonderfully describes in his book, are in a position of rational paranoia and humiliation and fear, subject not only to the private arbitration regime, but the private judicial system of Amazon that they have to find their way through. That position they are in is not unlike the position that Uber drivers are in relationship to Uber. One, again, of rational paranoia, where you see you're getting a ride one day and other rides, you're getting pushed in certain ways. You don't know, you get a ride just as you're about to go home. You don't know why you're being told to do what you were being told to do. You're told, the society tells you that you're free, but your experience is one of control, but no insight into why the controls are happening. A deep sense of being experiments and subjects in experiments as opposed to having autonomy. It's the same situation that you see among chicken farmers who I spoke to, who are not only facing mass depression, a lot of drug addiction, and real struggles with suicide, but also a kind of debilitating anger that comes along when you are subject to this, whether it's Tyson or Uber or Amazon, this private form of government that has massive control over you, treats you differently than treating your neighbor or the other Uber drivers, but you aren't allowed to know the ways in which you're treated differently. And one of the direct side effects that is genuinely terrifying because of the poverty it's leading to is that the effect is you hear this sort of extraordinary loud sucking sound of these choke point monopolies sucking wealth, the maximum wealth that they can from producers and workers to just keep them on the job. And because of their ability to peer inside, knowing basically what is your breaking point, sucking out all the value up to the breaking point. And it's basically a form of theft, as people 120 years ago knew. Monopoly is a form of theft. They're standing at this choke point roll and sucking it out. So it's leading to a terrifying degree of income inequality. But it's also leading, there's something really dangerous in a democracy when people live in a daily state of rational paranoia, anger, depression, and humiliation. Because if they have that experience in their daily job, feeling like they can't switch fast food jobs for a better deal because they're all owned by the same company, that has an impact on our politics and has a really depressing impact on our politics. Because if you don't feel power in your daily life, it's hard to then say, feel power once a year when you go to the polls. So those are some of the things. I think that the psychic costs are extraordinary, and then those psychic costs have a real impact on our ability to come together as a community when we've been so separated and treated so differently by these new governors. And as a community, ask each other, how do we want to live, which is, of course, the task of a democracy.
Yeah.
Great. And David, I mean, how about you? What was,
well,
what's the most important thing that people need to take away from?
I think just the enormity of it, perhaps because there's a dedicated tech press in America, a lot of times this concept of monopoly gets automatically conflated with the tech industry, and that the monopoly problem is actually a tech industry problem. And, to some extent that's true. We saw certainly in the House Antitrust Subcommittee hearings that these corporations in particular have a tremendous amount of power. I believe 20% of the S&P 500 is, for tech stocks. There is a level of a kernel of truth to that. But the larger truth is that if we somehow waved a magic wand and got rid of Amazon and Google and Facebook and Apple today, we would still have a terrible monopoly problem in this country. And, I think my eyes were open as to elements of that throughout reporting the book. I literally talk about monopolies in the baby formula industry and the coffin manufacturing and funeral home industry. So this is cradle to the grave kind of stuff. And as we go through life, we sort of get inured to it. We don't actually discern it to the level that it truly exists unless you kind of know what to look for. I related in the book briefly to putting on the sunglasses in the movie They Live, the 80s classic, where you put on the glasses and all of a sudden you see the subliminal messages everywhere. Once you don the glasses, you sort of learn that there's an illusion of choice out there. One thing that happened to me, I was at a rental car counter. This was like while I was reporting the book. I was at a rental car counter, and it was a Enterprise rental car. And they say, okay, just hold on 1 second. And the lady literally left the counter, went to the national rental car counter, picked up keys out of that counter, came back and said, here are your keys. And what you need to know is that Enterprise and National and Alamo as well are all owned by the same exact company. And then there it's literally the same bucket of keys. It's the same group. I had a similar situation at a hotel that I was staying at in New Jersey, which was both a Homewood Suites and a Hampton Inn. So, and they weren't adjacent. You literally could walk from the Homewood Suites to the Hampton Inn. There was a sign up that said, you are now entering the Hampton Inn. And they're both owned by Hilton. So the enormity of this, the illusion of choice, the fact that there's almost kind of a shadow play going on in the country, and the extent of monopoly is hidden to a certain extent. I think all of those things were eye-opening in the course of doing the book.
And by the way, I think you should buy 3 copies of David's book. And I will always say this about David, but he's very funny. So he has that kind of dark humor, and the moment where he's crossing from one hotel to the other is just one example of that. So, we'll talk about uplifting elsewhere. There's, if anybody can find humor in the dark situation that we're in, David can.
Yeah, and speaking of transitioning from one place to another, it's not just coffins, as it's also funeral homes have been monopolized and cemeteries have been monopolized. So, pretty much, the final rent you pay has already been jacked up. But let's give people a little sense of sort of, of the history of this effort to kind of fight back, because, one of the things I've known Zephyr. Zephyr's one of the very first people I connected with after writing Cornered, and it was our mutual friend Jed Purdy put us into contact. And I sent a copy to Jed and just said, you have to talk to Zephyr. She is the only person I know who talks that way. And, we got together, this must have been late 2010, and Zephyr was probably the only person I've met in this whole time who was a, fully formed anti-monopolist, and who actually understood the connections between anti-monopolism and populism, and who was a huge fan of the populist movement, and understood that that's the language we have to use to get out of this. Recently, and I was looking at a document that some of you guys know Joseph G. Varghese. Joseph is he's now running Our Revolution. He used to be at SEIU and changed to WIN. And Joseph and I got together back in 2011 and 2012 and said, hey, let's figure out how to turn this into a popular movement. And I was looking at the document we put together, which is a very good document, but then I looked at the names that were part of that document, and there's Zephyr, there was Joseph, there was Phil Longman, there was Lena Khan, there was Teddy Downey, Stacy Mitchell, and that was about it. So, when you sort of look back to 2011, 2012, Zephyr, we had so little. Are you sort of surprised at how far we've gotten?
Yes, but part of the reason we've gotten so far is a sad reason, that the concentration problem has gotten worse and the effects have gotten worse, and I think people are seeing it. I really see the seeds of the modern movement, and it is becoming a true movement, but we're still at a cusp stage, to be clear. So it's one of those moments. So it's exciting for all of you to be here, to be part of that. Is the crash of 2008, and the mainline institutions just total failure to respond to the crash in a coherent way. Not only with, despite some good things, the failure of Dodd-Frank to be a basic structural rewriting of something that had been toxic and destroyed so many people's lives. And the failure of people in both political parties to change the way they talked about anything. There was just sort of a sense that, a forest was wiped out and we're just going to keep talking the same way. Like nothing's changed, nothing happened here. And enough people directly experienced that, and enough people in the younger generation directly experienced the total disconnect between politics and institutional response. And to be frank, what's happening in economics academies, their sort of failure to respond or make sense or say, oh yeah, we got it wrong in a big way, like total failure. led to, I think, the seeds of this. And so then you see moments following 2008, including Occupy Wall Street as a key moment. Citizens United is another moment of just, wait, what? Our Supreme Court's allowing corporate speech? Just this total disconnect between our institutions, which are supposed to protect freedom, and what they're actually doing, which is undermining it. And then in the last 8 years, you've seen political campaigns start to bring it up. This past year, you saw it for, not for as much as I would have liked, but for several, maybe 6 weeks in the presidential campaign. It was a very central topic, not just big tech with Warren, but taking on ag with Bernie Sanders, who's made that a part of his work for a long time. I remember when he was fighting hospital monopolization back in the early 90s as a Congress member, and Amy Klobuchar talking about anti-monopoly as a core issue. So that was a key moment. Beating Amazon in New York was, I think, a really central moment to show that grassroots organizers strategically, there's really powerful alliances between people who were fighting for against gentrification, fighting against labor abuses, like Amazon's grotesque labor abuses, small businesses, local progressives coming together, beating back Amazon. That was a really important moment. And I actually see what's happening in California with the Uber-Lyft fight as a really important moment where people are saying, okay, I actually think people get it. We've had our tongues cut out. We haven't had a language to talk about this for 40 years. When I was talking about breaking up big banks in 2009, talking to policy think tanks in Washington around the time of Dodd-Frank, people would say, oh, that's an interesting idea, but that doesn't fit into any category of things we do, basically. That's, we're not gonna call that antitrust, and it's just not what we do. So we've moved from this sense of, okay, we've got to recover this language, these key moments. Oh, what I was going to say about the state action is now that people see, oh, you can take on Uber and Lyft on a state level, that there are hooks. There are places that can make a substantial change in people's lives in a very serious way. These companies are not invulnerable. Amazon can be beat in New York when it's in a love fest with the governor, and it can still be beat. That's amazing. So these moments are really, really critical moments. And then the pandemic has just made what you have written about so powerfully, Barry, the fragility that accompanies a monopoly economy, just so clear to people. Like, where are the ventilators? Where are the masks? Where are the hospital beds? Did we actually build a system that can't respond to crisis? And the answer is we did. And I think that has also woken people up. So we are at a new cusp moment. The most exciting thing, I think, is maybe not the most, these are all connected. An exciting component of this is Cicilline's antitrust subcommittee. I think it was co-founded by Keith Ellison, by the way, who's doing great work as a AG in Minnesota. Pramila Jayapal has been just an extraordinary leader on this. So we're at that moment, but I'd still say a majority of Democratic Congress members do not put this as a top of mind issue. So we've got a lot of work to do to change that.
Yeah, and actually, and to sort of reinforce what you just said, I mean, going back not to 2012, but 2016, and that was actually with David earlier mentioned when we were all together at the Netroots Nation meeting in St. Louis, and that was summer of 2016. And you were running in New York 19 at that point. That was the year that Senator Warren gave that fantastic speech in June of 2016 that sort of really changed the discussion in Washington about monopolization. That was the year that we got this issue into the Democratic platform for the first time in 30-something years. That was the year that the Obama White House actually realized, rather belatedly, that they had a monopoly problem, that we have a monopoly problem. And they came out with an executive order in April of 2016 saying, hey, we got a big problem in these last few months. Do whatever you can to try and fix it. And then as you mentioned, 2019, we have Senator Warren, Senator Sanders, and Senator Booker, and Amy Klobuchar all sort of pushing this. And this is a question for David, compared to like the feeling that we had the summer of 2016 or the summer of 2019, have we lost ground, or are we actually is the organizing just taking place in a different venue?
Yeah, I think we've gained ground. I mean, to the extent we have, organizations like yours are at the forefront of that. One big moment that you didn't mention was when you got fired by New America and moved your organization and sort of the bright light that shone on the power of these large corporations, not just in economic terms, but in political terms and in terms of the conversation in Washington. We've had these conferences, the University of Chicago, which have been very much part of moving the academic understanding of this problem. The first year, the question that was proposed at that conference was, is there a monopoly problem? And by the third year, they produced a white paper that said, this is how we're going to solve the monopoly problem. So there obviously was a great shift there. I think one thing that has been expanded is the concept of what the harms are to monopoly. For 40 years, we've been thinking about this in a very constrained consumer welfare kind of context, which usually just means prices. Your work and the work of so many people have expanded that playing field, talking about monopsony and labor harms, talking about quality issues, talking about the hidden risk of long supply chains and monopolized, concentrated modes of production, the democracy risk of converting economic power and political power, the inequality harms, the regional inequality harms, and what that means for startups and innovation and politics itself. I think that has come into the conversation in the last half decade. That was not necessarily, we were still sort of riding on Robert Bork's conception of what the playing field for monopoly, and we have expanded that playing field significantly, and it's very important to do so. And now, when bills come out, it's not about we need to put a moratorium on mergers because consumer prices will go up, but we need a moratorium on mergers because we have to look at the labor harms and we have to look at the inequality harms and things like that. So I would say there's been a gaining of ground. At the same time, I look at the parallels between the response to the financial crisis, where Zephyr rightly explains that we've had that progressives and liberals really did not have a plan for how to handle the financial crisis in the aftermath. And Timothy Geithner famously said, "Plan beats no plan," and that's why his conception of the post financial crisis landscape got into being. But I think you have to sadly make a parallel between that and the CARES Act and what was done after the coronavirus hit, and the sort of stumbling along into a bill that by its very design increases and accelerates corporate power at the expense of small businesses and individuals. It gave temporary relief when we knew we weren't going to get a second bite at that apple to individuals and small businesses, and gave permanent inequality busting and concentration busting support to the largest corporations in America, and directly allowed the Federal Reserve and the Treasury to do that and to expand that. So in some ways we've learned a lot. In other ways, I think the political system has not caught up. We are calling that out in more real time now in this iteration, but that's a bit of a cold comfort, and we need to get the political system to the place that the anti-monopoly movement is at. And ultimately in the book, I talk about the only way to do that, and Zephyr talks about this as well, the only way to do that is to build a political movement.
Can I jump in there, Barry, for a second?
Absolutely.
I think the CARES Act is so problematic in so many ways, but I think the CARES Act helps illustrate something, which is that part of the total stealing and destruction of core language that Bork and Reagan's wrecking crew succeeded in doing is they succeeded in taking away all this essential political language around anti-monopoly, convincing people it was just a small issue for economists to deal with. But also, I think people still, even if they understand that and they say, oh, I don't want a consumer price model, they still think of anti-monopoly as fairly small and dealing with questions of mergers and divestiture. And I may be part of the problem there, even the language, break them up, suggests that we're talking just about mergers and divestiture. But I'm not, and none of us are. The CARES Act was a pro-monopoly bill. It was, to me, as it was a constitutional moment in that it constituted the future of the American economy, at least for a while, in a really dangerous way. And once you understand, look at bills like that, through the lens of corporate power and where it locates corporate power, you see it's a very explicitly pro-monopoly bill. And so we have to, one, start looking at bills through the language of pro or anti-monopoly, whether or not they use the word antitrust or monopoly within them. The power dynamics are still there. If you give one chess player 7 queens and you give another chess player 1 extra queen, that's a pro-monopoly bill, because that's giving the wealthiest people in America relative power, and relative power is the game. It's about relative power of labor. It's about relative power of workers and small businesses. So I think it's really important that people understand that our conversation is not just about divestiture and merger policy, but also about all the kinds of policies that lead to this gross distortion of economic power.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's actually a terrifically important point. I mean, it's competition policy is how we make our democracy. I mean, this is competition policy is how we distribute wealth and opportunity, and so it's not real. It's fundamentally political. It's not an economic set of laws, and that's actually, it's been, when people try to make this an economic debate, what they're doing is they're hiding, either intentionally or unintentionally, the fact that competition policy is the extension of checks and balances from our systems of government into our political economy. And if we're not getting that right, there's going to be concentration of power and control over us. So one question, I'm going to ask one last question and then sort of bring in some of the questions we're getting from the audience. This is, David spoke about sort of and you both spoke about the crash of 2008 and 2009. And one of the things I remember is the journalists had done a terrible job in the period up to the crash and sort of alerting us to what was happening and who was doing what. But after the event, there was this flourishing of excellent journalism. And one of the one result was was David's own book from 2016, but it was a fantastic moment in journalism in 2009, 10, 11, 12, and we're not seeing that now. And is it your sense that this is what we're saying is the effects of this concentration of power over journalism, this sapping of this diverting of revenue from journalism? Are we in a point where our journalists are not able to help us understand the world the way they used to?
I mean, that's an interesting point. I do think there actually has been quite a bit of good journalism that has as, at its heart, though it may not be as explicit, the overwhelming influence of corporate power. I mean, you know, at the antitrust subcommittee hearings, journalism was brought up as the basis for a lot of that questioning, more than the own investigation of that committee. And I think you see it in other contexts as well. Fantastic reporting from New York Times about taxis and how the workers themselves are being completely robbed by the taxi companies is one that comes to mind, and you know, several others from your shop. I've certainly seen. I relied on a lot of on-the-ground journalism in this book, in things like the healthcare and hospital debate, and in things like the use of pharmaceutical middlemen, the example of the distributors, and the great work that the Washington Post did around distributors, and how they were dead to rights, and then the DEA let them off the hook. So at one level, I think journalism is helping us. At another level, there isn't enough journalism, and a lot of that is a function of Google and Facebook's ability to grind down local journalism. There's no question of that. There's a whole chapter in my book about that. That again points to this control. You know, Facebook, for example, which is the source of so many eyeballs. Anyone that is a publisher knows that they have to have a Facebook strategy to bring in people to their work. Facebook decided 4 or 5 years ago that they were now a video network. That everything was going to be video. They were going to, and they even wrote this blog post that essentially intimated to content producers, if you don't do video, you're not going to get very far on Facebook. And so a lot of these digital journalism sites fired their reporters, hired video makers, and completely revamped their operations into video making facilities and video making operations. And a couple of years later, it came out that all of the data that Facebook was giving to advertisers about how many views, video views and things like that they were showing on their site were bogus. I mean, completely bogus. They were not getting any kind of level of engagement that they said they were, and they knew it and lied about it to advertisers for a year. So after this, instead of there being sort of accountability and impact on Facebook changed their minds. They said, well, we're not doing video anymore. That's the end of that. And so all these digital operations that completely revamped themselves into video companies had to revert back into print operations or just go out of business. And usually it was the latter. I profile a journalist at Mike that takes me through that entire process. Mike is kind of sort of hanging on, but really is no longer with us after it was a very big and influential operation. So, you know, that has played out both in digital sites and especially in local news, where we have statistics where 1,800 counties across the United States do not have a local news outlet, a daily newspaper. So I think that journalism, when allowed to function, is going to be a powerful way to hold these monopolists to account. The problem is that the influence and impact of monopoly has narrowed the field for journalism. And so, and maybe Zephyr has some other thoughts on that.
No, that's great. I think you should really read David Dayen's book and Zephyr Teachout's chapter, both of them on this issue. Not only is it descriptive, but both of us are really committed to something really basic on this, which is this is not inevitable. There's a lot of inevitabilism talk around the internet's destruction of journalism. And these are market structure questions, and we can organize funding flows in different ways. And it's not going to be the same as 1970. You don't want it to be the same as 1970. We've got to take what is really good about the openness of the internet, but we do not have to allow Facebook and Google to choke local news, daily news to death. The New York Daily News just totally shut its newsroom here in New York City. A huge amount of losses there. The one other point I would make, which is less about journalism, is that if you're listening to this and you're interested and you want to do something, but it feels too big. Something that every level of government has the power to do is investigate. So whether you are talking to your city council or to your soil and water commissioner or to your state senator or to your Congress member, but I'm going to focus locally for right now. One thing they can do is haul people in and learn stuff. And when there is less journalism, it becomes even more important to do that learning, to find out, let's get to the bottom of exactly what Grubhub is taking from restaurants. Like, do that investigative work. And it's a place where you have outsized power because local lawmakers can learn things that then inform our ability to move forward.
I'm going to turn to some of the questions. One quick plug for the Open Markets Institute before I do that. We recently launched sort of a program within our institute, which is committed to finding or rebuilding a business model for journalism, an advertising-based business model. And it's the Center for Journalism and Liberty, and it was founded with support from the Knight Foundation, and there's a huge amount of interest in this issue now, so people are really focusing on it. We're very encouraged by that. But let me go to some of the questions. This is, in using the metric of choice to critique monopoly, are we invoking one of the values of consumerism? Is that the best critique strategically? And I'll turn that one over to David. And then there's a second half to that question, which is, will artificial intelligence consolidate corporate monopoly power further? And I'll turn that one over to Zephyr, but David, you go first.
Well, I mean, I I guess go back to what I said before, that, for 40 years, the terrain on which monopoly and particularly antitrust issues were fought was a very narrow terrain around consumer issues and very particularly consumer prices. Because you can have, you can think of consumer welfare in a whole lot of different ways. I mean, I have a whole chapter on airlines where we've been squished into this almost torture position in an airplane, and that's a consumer welfare issue, and it's entirely for profit-making instances, and that's something that I think is important. But the Bork vision is really a vision about prices. Because then he can find an economist, or the monopolist can find an economist to say, oh, this merger is going to affect prices. Now, it doesn't actually even make sense on its own terms. John Quokka at Northeastern University has done excellent work on this, finding that a lot of post-merger operations end up in higher prices. So it doesn't even work on itself, but it also is entirely too limiting. I actually made a conscious choice in my book to not look wherever possible at consumer prices, that this isn't about the cable company, there's only one cable company, so they charge more. That's true, but there are all kinds of harms that spring from only having one cable or one telecom company that go well beyond just price. And so I think that the playing field definitely needs to be expanded, that this is, if you're looking at something for the next administration to think about, it's changing those merger guidelines to go away from such a narrow focus and look at broader harms that are brought about by monopoly. So I'll just leave it there.
And then Zephyr, this is, will artificial intelligence consolidate corporate monopoly power further? And we're into the last 5 minutes, so let's keep the answers short, and so we can wrap up on a positive note, which is.
Okay. I got to really just briefly say about what David was talking about. I'll be very quick. in the field I used to be in, there's two kinds of laws, ways we approach things. There's bribery after the fact laws that look at particular interactions. And then there's these prophylactic laws, like you can't raise more than $2,600 from a person. You can't do this or that. And I think Bob Landy is on this call, who's done great work in this area, but we need in this field not only to change our values, but to move, just so you don't feel overwhelmed, just move to a prophylactic approach so that we have a structural approach so that we don't have to, in after the fact situations, try to find the particular harm. Well, we need to keep doing that. Yes, AI doesn't operate on its own. AI makes the abuses that accompany monopoly control much worse, and makes it easier once you have a foothold to use that little chokehold foothold to increase monopoly power. So I would say that because of AI, it's all the more important that we structurally have a more either decentralized economy or where centralized, subject to common carriage, public utility, public access regimes, because the dangers of control are much greater when you look when it accompanies both radical surveillance and AI.
Great. This is another question, and we don't have the names, so I won't be reading the names. I just have the questions. So this question is, given the people around Biden, and for that matter, the reality of Pelosi Schumer, is there serious hope for significant change, even if Dems sweep in November? What are the real pressure points to make the change we need?
I mean, the top thing is personnel. Who is going to be in these key positions at the Federal Trade Commission, at the Antitrust Division of the Justice Department? We have something of a leg up with the Federal Trade Commission because already in place is Rohit Chopra, who is an excellent force on these issues and who is in position to potentially be not just part of the majority, but the chair of that commission. And that should be an all-out effort to ensure that that happens if Biden wins the election. The other point is that there's more than the federal government that is important on these issues. You can look at the states, you can look at state attorneys general, you can look at state laws like on municipal broadband, you can look at laws on anti-chain store and zoning laws around dollar stores that has been in places like Tulsa, Oklahoma. You can look at North Dakota, which has a law, not just a public bank, but a law that says local individuals must be pharmacists. There are all sorts of ways to attack this problem, both from an antitrust perspective and an anti-monopoly perspective at all levels of government. The antitrust stuff, while state attorneys general play a role, a lot of that is in the federal government, but anti-monopoly stuff, you can do that at the local level, and I think that's a terrific place to start.
And let me, Zephyr, let me give you a slightly different version of that question. Which is, what is your advice to young people who recognize the enormity of this problem and want to commit their time to being a part of the solution?
One, make it part of your analysis. So whatever you're thinking about, bring an anti-monopoly question. When you're looking at healthcare, say, oh my gosh, not only do I want Medicare for all, but we have a hospital network consolidation problem. I promise you, if you bring this question to everything, as David, you'll put on the glasses and you'll suddenly see the new world and new views. So bring the power analysis is one when you're seeing, and when you're acting, besides reading a lot on these issues, I actually think that there is a real question mark with Biden, especially given the scope of the economic crisis that we're facing. And I think it's incredibly important to bring it into people's activism. We are not going to get out of the economic crisis without doing some anti-monopoly work to revive. And that means turning the machine around, not just stopping mergers, but turning the machine around and funding funding in a FDR second term kind of way. So you can follow some of the existing activist groups that are coming together, like Athena, Barry's Shop, ILSR. All of those are important. But the truth is, just to be frank, I'm always frank, there are not tens of thousands of anti-monopoly leagues around the country. There are not enough people connecting the destruction of Black businesses to our choice, and we're talking about as much as 40 or 50% of Black businesses could go under in this, to our choices in the CARES Act and to our pro-merger policy. Be part of building local community work that says we aren't going to take this like pro-monopoly politics anymore, and you're going to have to create things that don't yet exist.
Okay, that's terrific, and we are at time, but maybe we can sort of each have one final word, and I guess my question to each of you is, if all of the people listening to this discussion actually went out there and began fighting tomorrow, and many of them are actually already fighting, but if everyone sort of goes and drags a couple more people into the fight, and we really turn this into a true mass movement, how many years till we win?
The last chapter of my book looks at what happened in Israel, and that was a situation where they were almost as much, if not more, concentrated than we are. They had all these interlocking directorates and these tycoons that controlled 60 different business lines and things like that. And I believe that Guy Rolnick started the marker, which was really the sort of kickoff to an anti-monopoly way of thinking and anti-monopoly critique of that country. I think he started it right after 9/11, right? He started it like kind of in 2002, 2003 or something. It really wasn't until 2011 and 12 when a mass movement actually got onto the streets in Israel, at first protesting high food prices and high housing prices, but then making a broad overall critique of the tycoons that controlled that economy. Then there was action fairly swiftly. So, I think these things happen slowly, as they have been over the last 10 years under, your leadership, Barry, and others. And then it happens all at once. So these things kind of crawl and then they fly out of the gates. And so that is what you could see.
Zephyr, is this one of those moments when it's actually starting to really happen?
Yeah, it is. And first of all, I love this chapter on this. It is inspiring. And so what I forgot to say is go protest your cable company because once you broaden the framework to anti-monopoly, it's actually easier. You don't have to spend one day fighting Pfizer and the next day fighting Spectrum. You can just bring this approach everywhere. I think we could be 11 to 20 years away, and I don't think I don't think any of us can know. But I do think that the biggest reason this can't happen is people feeling either too stupid or too impotent, and don't listen to the Borkians who are telling you you're too stupid and don't know what the HI index is, and you are not impotent. This is the level of not just fake dissatisfaction, but deep, honest dissatisfaction is so deep that if we can make those connections, and in particular, join forces between small business owners and labor, and to me, that is the core of the change. When that happens, it can happen in a few years.
A few years. So here's your guides. I encourage you all to, again, buy at least 2 copies of this, and also Monopolized. So anyway, it's terrific to have you both. It was a great conversation, and look forward to the next. And and thank you everybody for joining us today. And we will This will be posted, so if anybody has any questions about what was said, you can go back and review it. But again, thank you all.
Thank you, Barry.
Thank you, Barry.